For this opportunity to share my work. I'm going to talk about a project that looks at the potential equity implications of microtransit, a regional microtransit system in Detroit, Michigan. This is a collaborative effort between myself and a group at Ford Motor Company, so a team that's under the division of mobility and robotics there. And this effort started in June. It's like I can hear myself, but I guess, yeah. So this effort started just this past June, and it'll be ongoing for the next 2 years. So I'm going to talk about some preliminary results, and but we will have more time to strengthen these results going forward. So. Just next. So I like to start with a little bit of motivation. So there are 3 points that I want to make. One is that as most of us in here are aware, there's a long history of inequity, particularly in Detroit, across the United States. And I always like to start with this example of Black Bottom in Detroit in the early 60s. This was in the name of urban renewal, where in order to make way for I-75, a part of the interstate highway system, a number of African Americans, an entire community actually was uprooted and displaced to make way for this, the new technology of the day. And this is something that happened time and time again across the United States. And I think it's a really sort of clear example of how lower income and minority communities were displaced or made to be worse off in an effort to roll in this new technology of the time that is a greater good for the society. And so this is part of a motivation so that, as we are rolling out next generation transportation systems, we want to be aware of this phenomena that has occurred in the past and make sure that we are considering these phenomena as we go forward. Another part of the motivation, so in 2018, Ford Motor Company announced that they would be purchasing the Central train station in Detroit, and the Central train station, for those who are unaware, this was the passenger rail depot in Detroit. It ran from the early 1900s to the 1980s. And it was a shining example of public transportation in its day, although it's been pretty much an eyesore since it closed in the 80s. It sat vacant for a long time, so it's a pretty big deal that Ford has decided to purchase this property and make it, transform it into their innovation hub in the area. So this will be the seat of their activities around autonomous vehicles and next generation transportation systems. So, as a part of their planning for this project, they're also aware that they need to understand the ramifications of any new system that they propose. And so this is a part of the motivation for this collaboration, where they're interested in understanding, what are the potential equity impacts of a new transit system in the city. And then finally, we know that there exists a group of community members that we define as transport disadvantaged. These are communities that, for various reasons, they are unable to access gainful employment, healthy foods, and educational opportunities in the area. And so we refer to them as transport disadvantaged. They include the elderly, they include low-income and minority communities, and zero auto households. There is a lot of research, there's extensive research on how do you define these communities, but from a modeling perspective, we have to figure out some way to simplify. So I simplify in terms of the zero auto households, which represent a significant share of the population in the United States. Across the United States, this is 7 to 10% of the population, but in Detroit, we're talking about a quarter of the city. And then in terms of households, we're talking about Right,
You
right,
gotta remember.
right. Sorry about that. Okay.
This is
Yeah, yeah.
slide notes.
I apologize. Yeah. So I'm showing here some statistics on zero auto households and impoverished households in Detroit versus United States, and so things are pretty. We see a lot more zero auto households in Detroit as compared to the United States. And then we see quite a few more people living under the poverty line in Detroit as compared to the United States. Okay. So what we wanted to do was to leverage a demand modeling framework to estimate a measure of accessibility and to perform an equity analysis using that accessibility measure. And we did this at the disaggregate as well as aggregate level. What we did was to take an existing travel demand model or components of an existing travel demand model that was built by the MPO of the area, so the Metropolitan Planning Organization over Detroit, which is called SIMCOG, the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. And they maintain the model for the region, and they do all of the planning exercises for the region. And so we took their model, we sort of truncated it, and made it more tractable for our purposes. And so what I'm showing you is their destination mode choice model, which is on the right, and then our truncated version that's on the left. And essentially what we did was to, in order to speed up the run times, but also maintain a certain level of sensitivity. This is why we truncated the model. But basically we took away some of the transit alternatives. So in the original model, the transit alternatives are further distinguished by access mode. So basically we truncated that, and we're just using 3 of the transit modes, 3 of the auto modes, and then we have walk and bike. Okay. All right. So, and why accessibility? Well, I mean, I think I'm pretty much preaching to the choir, but there's a lot of research that shows that if we're talking about equity analysis, we need to be looking at accessibility. This is a measure of the ease of reaching desirable land use activities using the transportation system. And in particular, we're using the log sum accessibility measure. So we talked a lot about this yesterday. And the reason why is because we wanted to have a singular measure that is sensitive to all modes of transportation, sensitive to both the transportation system and land use changes, so the attractiveness of locations. And we also wanted something that can be individual level, individual specific. And so sensitive to things like income and all of the characteristics that we have available about an individual. Okay. So a little bit about how we calculate this measure. This comes directly from the demand model. We estimate components of the demand model using what's called a discrete choice model. And so this is our effort to estimate the sensitivity of the choice of mode or the choice of travel activity to characteristics of the individual and attributes of each of those alternatives. And so if anyone knows anything about logit, you know that we have this probability equation. That's the probability of the choice I given the choice set for the individual. And then we have utilities that go into this calculation of probability. The point I want to make here is that the log sum is taken directly from the choice probability model, so it's just the denominator of the model. And in terms of how we calculate it, so I'm going to just go through this, I think, in the most clearest language that I have. So the point I want to make is that the model is very sensitive, again, to individual characteristics and characteristics of the transportation system and characteristics of land use. And so we start with the utility of the mode choice model And this is a measure of the benefit or worth derived from each mode of transportation available. And how that enters into this formulation is in these X's and these betas. The X's are things like travel time, travel cost, age, gender, income, and then the betas are the sensitivity. So these are the things that we estimate, or at least SIMCOG has estimated, to understand how those attributes contribute to the choice or the behavior that we care about. So we start with our mode utility, and then we estimate the log sum, which is the expected maximum utility from that mode choice model. Then we enter that mode choice log sum into a destination choice model. And so this is a model of how people are making choices to travel to different locations based on the attractiveness of those locations. And so this is a point about how the two pieces are linked. We linked these pieces together, and what we end up with is a measure that is both sensitive to the mode choices and attributes of the different modes, as well as sensitive to land use and the attractiveness of zones in geographic space. And then finally, one of the features of the destination choice model is that we're doing this based on employment, and so the interpretation is that we have a measure that's sensitive to the employment in the region and how employment is changing. Okay, so I hope that that is enough, and I can talk a lot more about that if there are additional questions. In terms of the data, so we used a number of different data sets to do this project. One is that so the model was previously estimated again by SIMCOG. We used the 2015 Me Count survey, which is a travel activity survey for the Detroit region, to apply this model, okay? And also for validation and sensitivity analysis, which I'm not showing here. And then we also use a lot of data from SIMCOG, and so this includes the employment data by zone. So they have to do these projections every time they estimate a new model, and so we use their employment projections and their estimates for travel time and travel cost and distances. So I want to talk a little bit about the survey, and so what I'm showing you here, oh wow, okay. All right, so we see what we expect to see when it comes to income, whereas we have lower income individuals who are more likely to do things like walk and take transit, and higher income people are more likely to take automobile. Okay, so how are we setting up microtransit? So just a few things about our assumptions. We assume that there's an access time, a waiting time, and in-vehicle travel time. Cost, the variable cost is calculated per mile. And then we have, so those are the components that we care about. And then another important thing here is that we assume that all residents, we assume that all residents have access to this microtransit. So we have a system where individuals are told to meet at a location based on what their travel need is. So you pull 8 to 15 people in a location. A shuttle picks them up, takes them to another location that's very close to their destination, and we're assuming that they'll have an access time that's no greater than 7 minutes and a waiting time that's no greater than 10 minutes. Okay. So the results, I'll tell you the punchline first, and then I'll talk as much as I can given the time. So basically what we're finding is that after our scenario analysis, that if we look at the average change in accessibility, we're finding that the gap between high income people and low income people actually slightly widens. And we think the reason why that is that there is a small but significant share of low income households that are not seeing any benefit or change due to the microtransit system. Okay, so, and that is seen in this bottom table here, where we look at the average change in log sum. We look at that for low income and high income groups, and then for 0 auto and 1+ auto households. And then in the yellow, we're looking at the percent change. So how much is it changing for each group, and how different is that between the groups? Okay, so essentially what we're seeing is that for the low income group, they're experiencing like a 3% improvement, while higher income people are experiencing like a 4% to 5% improvement. And so that is what we're seeing, is that we're seeing that because some individuals are not experiencing a change, that the gap is slightly widening. And this is a disaggregate comparison where we're showing the individual level changes experienced by everyone in the sample. And what we see is that if we take the change in log sum and we plot the density of that change, we get a plot that looks like this for income class and then automobile class. And what we're seeing is that lower income people are more likely to experience a smaller gain than high income people. And we see that distinction for income. We don't see as much of a distinction for auto class. So just the highlights, again, we think that what we're seeing is that what we're picking up on with this log sum measure is that there are, for a number of people, the introduction of microtransit doesn't look like a better option, and that might be due to higher costs in those areas. So for some people, they're seeing the introduction of a new system that costs more than what they have available, and so it looks kind of like a inferior option for them. And so, while these are small shares, we're talking about 4%, 2%. It's significant enough to appear as if some people are left behind while others are improving with regard to accessibility. This is approximately 70,000 people in the area, so those small percentages, represent about 60,000 people in the Detroit area. And so while small, this is the size of a small city in the area. So we've done this analysis on the aggregate and disaggregate level using a measure that we believe is very sensitive to things like costs and the distinctions between available modes. And we're seeing that there are people who are being left behind, but I think that one of the takeaways is that there's so much that we don't understand about the differences in cost between available modes and the introduction of a new microtransit mode. We need to look into cost structures that might result in more equitable returns to the people who need access to microtransit. So I'm sorry, I feel like I just kind of ran through that to get through it, but I'll stop there and I'll be available for questions.